An old dispute between two old enemies that now threatens to draw in other countries. China and Japan have upped the ante in their fight over a chain of islands. And the US has waded in. So where now for relations between two of the world's biggest powers? This is Inside Story. Hello there, thanks for joining us. I'm Shuli Ghosh. China and Japan have argued over a chain of islands in the East China Sea for a very long time. But now the tension has been ratcheted even higher after China unilaterally declared a new airspace defence zone over the islands. The Americans have responded by pledging their support for Japan. Known in Japan as the Senkakus and in China as the Diaoyu, these islands are actually under the administrative control of Tokyo. But China says it has sovereignty, and the government is demanding that any planes flying there must identify themselves to Beijing. Senior US administration officials say China's decision raises serious concerns about its intentions. And in a show of support for Japan, two US bombers deliberately flew over the islands without telling China about it. Stephanie Scowen reports.
It might take only one tiny miscalculation or one tiny misunderstanding, and these islands could become the centre of a large international conflict. To the Japanese, they're the Senkakus. To the Chinese, the Diaoyus. Now, thanks to China's unilateral introduction of what it calls an Air Defence Identification Zone, or ADIZ, they're the most talked about islands in Asia. And politics at home have a lot to do with it.
China, Japan and Korea are all facing domestic issues, and they want to divert people's attention to security and diplomatic matters. So these countries want to find another issue they can quarrel about.
China's decision to impose its control over the airspace has upset its immediate neighbours Japan and South Korea. But Kamiura argues it's the US that is most annoyed.
The ADIZ was originally introduced by the United States after Japan's defeat in the Second World War to secure Japan's safety. This is a US invention, and China is trying to introduce a new order. That's why the US is more sensitive to this than Japan.
And on the streets of Tokyo, there is concern.
I just can't understand why anyone would do this. If you don't know what your neighbour's thinking, that becomes a reason to be afraid.
My feelings of mistrust, anxiety and nervousness have all increased.
The islands were never more than a footnote in Asian geopolitics until a UN survey more than 40 years ago. That suggested there could be large oil deposits beneath the seabed around them. And that's what got Taiwan and then China originally interested. But now, with so many countries involved, a small misstep could have serious consequences for peace in the region. And it's that kind of miscalculation that American Vice President Joe Biden hopes can be avoided when he visits the region next week. With oil deposits yet to be proven, the islands hold little real value. And it could all just be a high-stakes confrontation over nothing. Stephanie Scowen, Al Jazeera, Tokyo.
So to discuss all of this, let's bring in today's guests. In Beijing, we've got Peter Ford, who's the Bureau Chief of the Christian Science Monitor in China. In London, Christian Lemierre, Senior Fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And in Washington, D.C., Richard Weitz, Senior Fellow and the Director for the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Christian, let's start with you. So what is China's intention here by establishing this air defence zone? Is it flexing its military muscles?
In my opinion, no. I think this is more of a form of shadow puppetry by China within the East China Sea. The ADIZ is meant to demonstrate continued or renewed Chinese administration of the airspace and is intended to demonstrate equality with Japanese administration of the airspace, much like the Chinese maritime law enforcement vessels around the islands of the Senkaku-Diaoyu chain are intended to demonstrate Chinese administration of the waters. This is simply taking the same principle to the air above the islands themselves.
There is a slightly sinister tone to its statement, though. China saying China will take timely measures to deal with air threats and unidentified flying objects from the sea. What are timely measures?
Well, it's not very clear. Obviously, the vagueness of the statement, which is not unusual for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs or National Defense, makes it slightly difficult to gauge exactly what the intentions here are. But given the effective level of military deterrence on all sides of this particular dispute, the great economic costs and opportunity costs of any kind of conflict whatsoever, and the fact that China is or has in the last few years attempted to avoid escalation by deploying unarmed ships to the islands, it does seem to suggest that the entire strategy is one of conflict management rather than escalation or resolution of any form.
Do you agree with that, Richard? Because you've got a situation where the US has come in declaring openly that it supports Japan over this. That's because of its defence pact with Tokyo, isn't it?
Yes, and what I think, I mean, Peter's correct in why technically they're proceeding. They're looking at what Japan has exercised over the islands and trying to reciprocate in terms of setting up an air identification zone and having naval patrols and so on. But in the larger context, how it's looking in at least the United States is that China is trying to expand its influence and correspondence with its rising military power and other aspects of national strength. And that what we're seeing here is a probe that, left unaddressed, will be followed by other probes, perhaps against Japan, perhaps against Vietnam, maybe India next. And basically, China will continue to expand to what it sees as its rightful position as the dominant actor in East Asia. And that's obviously then runs up against the U.S. security commitments of the Philippines and Japan and other U.S. interests.
So the fact that the U.S. has flown these two B-52s into this airspace, does that mean it's not just viewing this as a Japan-China dispute? It is actually seeing this as a test of wills with Beijing?
Well, the specific issue is a test between China and Japan, but it's also a test, we believe, of the U.S.-Japan alliance. And the thinking is, if the U.S. were not to stand by Japan, that would send a very disruptive message to Tokyo and a very unfortunate message to China. They continue to make these probes. So you're having the U.S. take this action, send two unarmed B-52s through the zone without following the procedures China has laid down in order to affirm that we consider these islands to be part of Japanese administration and that China's move is not accepted.
Peter, let me bring you in because you're in Beijing. What is the mood where you are over this issue?
Well, the Chinese have been trying to play things down over the last 24 hours or so, because since they made their statement last Saturday, which came as a complete surprise to everybody, came out of the blue, and it caused an almighty stink throughout the region. We've had not only the Americans flying their B-52s into the zone, but both South Korea and Japan announced today, Thursday, that they too had flown their aeroplanes into the new ADIZ without giving any warning to the Chinese. And nothing happened. When the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman was asked today what China would do about this, he said that China would take appropriate measures, it would respond appropriately depending on the level of threat that it perceived. But basically, we've had three countries concerned by this ADIZ fly their aeroplanes into the zone, announce it publicly, and China has not responded. So the mood, frankly, is also, I think, a little bit embarrassed.
But internally, is there also a feeling that is there pressure on the Chinese authorities to take a stronger position? Is it raising nationalistic feelings? Because there has been this dispute with Japan over many things, and now it's come down to these fly-speck islands, which no one knows really if they're of any value or not.
Yes, well, the whole dispute with Japan over the islands known as the Diaoyu here in the Senkaku in Japan has raised nationalist feelings for the last year or so since the crisis broke out. And when the government made its announcement on Saturday, it was greeted with a good deal of enthusiasm on nationalist websites and by nationalist voices in China. But nationalism is a difficult force to control, and while it may be that the government is keen on using it and harnessing it, even the People's Liberation Army Daily said in an editorial over the weekend, before we knew that the Americans had flown their aeroplanes into the zone, that unless China can actually enforce this ADIZ, unless it can actually make people do what it asks them to do, that it's merely, quote, armchair strategy, unquote. And I think this is a risk that the government does run.
OK, let's take a closer look at China. 30 years of economic boom have made China the world's second largest economy. And with that growth, it has sought to flex its muscles and extend its regional influence. It openly sided with Russia and opposed any military intervention in Syria, vetoing 3 UN resolutions. Despite various attempts by the US to persuade China to sanction Iran, China remained the only major player active in Tehran that refused to adhere to any international restrictions. And in addition to the island dispute with Japan, it's also engaged in sovereignty issues with Taiwan, Vietnam, Philippines and Malaysia. Christine, do you think China has been getting more aggressive in the region as its influence has grown?
I think the term that's normally used to refer to China's policy in its near abroad is assertive, and I think there's a reason for that, partially because the Chinese consider their activities to be very reactive to actions that have been taken by their neighbours, and partly because many of the policies being pursued and the tactics being used are not necessarily very militaristic in nature, but are intended to demonstrate greater Chinese confidence and willingness to try and enforce their will and coerce others through softer security or softer power capabilities than purely their military. I think there's a number of reasons why we see the island disputes, in particular in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, coming to fruition over the last few years, and it's partially to do with the shared history behind all of these islands. It's partially to do with a stabilization of the domestic situation within various countries, including China and Vietnam, so they're now able to look to their maritime periphery. It's partly to do with the codification of international law, whereby everyone is now more aware of how much oil and gas and how much water and airspace and continental shelf that they could claim sovereignty or jurisdiction over. And it's partly to do with the greater capability to project their power at sea as well, not just in China, but also in the Southeast Asian countries.
Do you think,
and to a greater extent,
there's a lot
of
criticism of China for unilaterally extending this ADIZ, but how much is Japan to blame for raising the tensions? Because it actually changed the status quo last year, didn't it, by buying up 3 of these disputed islands from a private owner?
Yeah, I mean, I think the situation is slightly complex. I mean, in the South China Sea, for instance, China considers Vietnamese and Philippine attempts to unilaterally pursue oil and gas exploration activities in the South China Sea as kicking off the recent round of tensions. And there is some justification to that, but China's reaction is often overpowering and excessive and perhaps overzealous, and is therefore seen as much more assertive and at times aggressive. Similarly, with the East China Sea, the decision to nationalise 3 of the islands in September 2012 by Japan, not only was it well known beforehand by the Chinese government it would happen, allowing it to coordinate its response, but the shift in activity and policy by China is seen by Japan as threatening and assertive because it goes over and beyond what the Tokyo government considers to be appropriate behaviour within it. So yes, you know, China would certainly claim that other states have shifted the status quo first, but China's assertiveness and reaction is seen as excessive given whatever changes to the status quo have occurred.
Richard, Peter was saying earlier on that, of course, it's not just Japan that's been worried by this. Several countries have raised condemnation or regrets about this. South Korea in particular worried because the extension of this ADIZ also covers a reef which Seoul controls. What is the impact it's having on that region?
I think that you laid that out quite well, that the reaction has been very negative. The China exclusion zone, this air identification zone covers Japan, but it also covers South Korea. South Korea has now flown its planes through that without acknowledging the zone. It said it's going to extend its own zone. And Chinese officials, at least at the time they made this declaration, I haven't seen this in the last 24 hours, but a couple days ago they implied that they were going to issue more of these kind of identification zones, and that you could see in coming up against what the Philippines considers its territory, Vietnam, and so on. And so you're seeing every country there which has potential conflict with China thinking, well, am I going to be next? And so that's, I think, where you're seeing a lot of the countries rally behind Japan in this case, because they worry that if China doesn't back down in this case, then they're going to just go ahead and make some more of these zones, and they'll take other actions. I agree. I wouldn't call their actions aggressive. They are assertive. But as a rising power, we've all been a bit struck by how non-aggressive China has been in terms of throwing around its military weight compared, say, to Imperial Germany and Japan, Rome, and some other past rising hegemons.
OK, well, let's look at the relationship between the US and China, which has been under strain of late. In 2011, the US announced a $5.9 billion arms deal with Taiwan, which prompted an angry response from China. That same year, President Obama's high-profile pivot towards Asia was viewed by China as a military strategy to contain its growing influence. Monetary policy continues to be one of the major disputes, with the US arguing that China has deliberately undervalued its currency. And on Wednesday, as we've seen, US Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel reaffirmed American support for Japan in its dispute with China over the disputed islands. Peter, let's talk about this US pivot towards Asia. I mean, one of its goals was to achieve better relations with China. Has it been seen as a success at all, or has it simply made China feel more isolated?
Well, I think the Chinese government certainly sees what the Americans call a rebalancing as an attempt to potentially contain China. They see it as a refusal by the United States to accept China's growing role in the Western Pacific and a deliberate attempt to try and hem China in and limit its growth. I mean, this is obviously going to be probably the top issue now on the agenda when Vice President Joe Biden comes to Beijing early next week. Initially, he was going to be dealing with economic questions. I think quite simply now he's going to be dealing mainly with this.
Yeah, I think the tone of that visit might change somewhat when he visits Asia next week.
I suspect so. I mean, I don't know that he's going to add anything to what Chuck Hagel and John Kerry have already said, but he will be repeating it even more forcefully, I think, that both the United States and Japan, and of course everyone else in the region, the Koreans, the Taiwanese, the Filipinos, the Australians, all of them regard this as a destabilizing measure, a step that could open the way to dangerous miscalculation. And I think Mr. Biden will be making that point quite forcefully when he's here. How the Chinese will react to it is hard to say.
Well, what do you two other gentlemen think about the Asia pivot, or as Peter rightly points out, it's had its name changed to rebalance? Christian, do you think that Asia understands what that was all about?
I mean, I think they fully understand what it's about. The rebalance, and let's be clear here, the rebalance announced in late 2011, early 2012 is not much of a rebalance at all. In terms of military assets that are being deployed to the region, we look at 4 littoral combat ships being deployed to Singapore, up to 2,500 Marines to Australia. In reality, there are more shifts within Asia than to Asia. A big deal was made at one of the IISS conferences in Singapore about the US Navy in the future basing 60% of its assets in the Pacific rather than 50%. But 60% of a Navy of about 250 ships is roughly the same as 50% of a Navy of about 300 ships. So in reality, we're not looking at, given the declining number of assets in the US Navy, we're not looking at a significant shift of military materiel since 2011. There has been a shift since 2002, which is when we could really see the rebalance actually starting, with Guam being built up as a major naval base and forward deployment of nuclear submarines to Guam itself. But the rebalance since 2011 has been relatively modest. Now, this is partially because the US is suffering from austerity at home.
It's been very difficult for President Obama to sell this.
Absolutely.
Is there anything other than a military strategy?
No, absolutely. I mean, they have changed their tone, and the reason it's being called a rebalance is for a number of reasons. They want to emphasize the economic and diplomatic aspects of it. But my point is that the rebalance is, in and of itself, largely a rhetorical device. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't sustenance to it, and its effects have been significant. The point of the rebalance is to reassure allies within Asia, but also to deter, if not provoke, China. Its effects are probably not as wide-ranging as those two twin objectives are meant to be, and I don't think allies have been as reassured as they would like to be, and I think China has been put on the defensive and sees it as a containment strategy rather than anything else.
Do you agree with that, Richard?
So there's no doubt there is a significant military aspect to it.
I would agree with the broad interpretation in terms of the facts that were laid out, that the balance, the rebalance has been less significant in practice than in its public portrayal. But that's partly deliberate, that the hope was, I mean, what they found themselves in when they were coming into office, 2009, we were sort of in the same situation. The Chinese had been were basically throwing their weight around within the ASEAN community. They were harassing U.S. Surveillance ships in the area, and there was just a concern in the region that China had it was taking, and was misperceiving the problems the U.S. was having financially as a sign of U.S. decline, that the other Asian countries were also worried about a lack of strong leadership with the U.S. distracted in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. So they came in and said they were going to prioritize Asia in terms of focusing their resources in the future, and they wanted to, basically they were very happy with the way the situation in Europe has evolved, and the Middle East was a bit of a stagnating, stalemate. There wasn't really much to do there, and they wanted to focus a lot of their efforts in Asia, and this is partly designed to reassure allies and discourage China from taking aggressive actions.
Okay.
But in execution, it hasn't really involved that much of a shift in terms of forces. It's been a lot of show and tell, smoke and mirrors.
Sorry to interrupt you, Richard. I just want to throw in a bit of history here, because it all seems so different back in 1972 when the President of the United States at the time, Richard Nixon, made a groundbreaking trip to China. It was seen as the first step in normalizing relations with the Communist People's Republic, and the repercussions of the visit were vast. The balance of the Cold War shifted, with China now joining the US against the Soviet Union, and in 1979 the US established full diplomatic relations with China. Peter, how does China view relations with the US now? That it kind of seems to go along in peaks and troughs, doesn't it? They never quite see eye to eye.
No, I mean, China regards its relationship with Washington very much as Washington regards its relationship with China as the single most important relation it has, and probably the single most important relation in the world. China wants to be seen as an equal. China wants the United States to treat it as a serious world power and an equal, not as the humiliated China that it remembers from the 19th century and earlier 20th century. It feels now that as the second largest economy in the world, with growing military power, although that military power is light years away from the United States' strength, they do regard themselves as the natural regional superpower, and they want the United States to take them seriously. The thing is that when they behave in the way they have done over the weekend, dropping bombshells like this ADIZ on the region, they make it, I think, harder for the rest of the region to look favourably on them.
Well, very quickly, Peter, how do you see this current dispute playing out? Because the US says it's going to send more jets in that region. How do you see this playing out?
Well, I think that the Chinese are going to play it very carefully. I mean, over the islands as a whole, they've been very cautious not to send their military forces into or near Japanese territory, and I don't think they want to make any sorts of mistakes. But if they do find that they are obliged by public opinion here to actually enforce this zone, then I think we're in for some very nervous times, because the Chinese military is simply not, as far as I understand it, not militarily capable of being 100% sure of what they're looking at when their radars see different sorts of aircraft, especially at low levels in that zone, and we could find ourselves in a situation where mistakes, and tragic mistakes, could be made.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us today on the programme. Peter Ford, Christian Lemierre and Richard Weiss. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. You can tweet us your thoughts. Our Twitter name is @AJ Inside Story. Until next time, from me, Shuli Ghosh. Bye for now.